Hello and welcome back, I suppose, to East of Ethnia. What I want to talk about today is local elections that took place yesterday in Serbia. I want to try to give you an idea of how we got to these local elections, what's likely to happen in the future, and generally discuss what the results were. So one thing I can say about elections is that since November, when there was the train station disaster in Novi Sad, and the attacks on students that followed the protests after those disasters, there have been 7 months of unbroken protests across the country, with the students making several demands. Initially, one of the demands that was forming, it was not officially on the list of demands, was the demand for the resignation of the government and the formation of a transitional government. And this transitional government would have a maximum time of duration. Its principal job would be to organize new elections that would be free and fair elections, and as part of its work, as the major part of its work, to establish conditions that would make it possible for elections to be free and fair. So this includes cleaning up the voters' lists, removing non-residents and people illegally registered from the voting lists, trying to establish a media environment in which there would be equal rights of access for different parties. So all of the conditions for free and fair elections. But in the last month, the students in the protest movement stepped away from the demand for a transitional government and for reform of the electoral law and electoral conditions, probably calculating that they were not likely to get any movement on this demand, and instead have asked simply for elections to be held. So this shift from demanding conditions for a free and fair elections to simply demanding elections is a major strategic shift, and it's a major strategic shift that comes at a very high risk because what they're asking for is for elections to be held under conditions that are controlled by the regime in power that has consistently practiced various types of intimidation and electoral fraud and manipulation of electoral conditions to try to guarantee a particular result. So it is a high risk strategy, and we had a test of that strategy with the local elections that were held in two locations in Serbia yesterday. And what can we say about the results of that test? The first thing that we can say is that all of the techniques for manipulating the process of elections that we became familiar with over the last several years are still very much in place. This includes some heavy-handed techniques like buying votes, like intimidating voters, stuffing ballot boxes with ballots that are already prepared, using this trick in which voters are given a pre-filled ballot to put into the box and then demonstrate that they have put that pre-filled ballot into the box by giving the empty ballot to the person who is demanding them or compensating them to do this. There are further techniques that we became familiar with in the last several local elections, particularly in the December elections in Belgrade, including registering and voting by people who do not live in the place where they're voting. Um, Voting by people who are not registered in those places. All of these things have been happening, and we have seen a new technique being introduced and tested, which is the registration of phantom non-governmental organizations for the monitoring of elections. The one that was most active in these elections was one that was founded just a couple of weeks ago, on May 12th. There are two organizations, both registered to the same address, both registered to people who are closely connected with the party in power. And this is a technique that the regime has been using across different fields for a while. They have their phantom research organization called the Center for Social Stability. They have their phantom student organization called Students 2.0 and so on. And this is their first phantom election monitoring organization, which they have been testing. And the activity of this phantom election monitoring organization appears to be to accuse the opponents of the regime of doing exactly the things that the regime is doing. And the result has been a standoff. you have these very close results in both places, and you have both sides declaring that they have won the election, along with an increasingly long list of charges relating to irregularities in the elections. So, what can we say about this unclear result and the sort of standoff that's developed? Well, here's one thing that I think we can probably say, and that is that parliamentary elections are probably going to be called, and they're probably going to be called this year, because I think even if the regime gets away with legitimating the result of its falsified elections, the blow is still strong enough that they have had to resort to outrageous claims and other types of intimidation. They don't have the kind of easy victory that they have had in the past, so their legitimacy is being tested. So I am going to predict that elections will be called sometime this year. The other thing that I will predict is that they will be dirty. Elections have been dirty before in the recent past and even farther into the past, but you can see now the stakes are higher, the tensions are higher. You're going to see more intimidation, more use of these techniques for inflating the pro-regime vote. There's another thing that I think we can say about elections, and that is there's discussion among people engaged in the student protests to run a student list for elections, that is, not to rely on any of the existing opposition parties, which are unreliable and weak, and instead run a kind of consensus list of specialists whose job would be to carry out reform if elected. The risk of doing this is high because although support for the students and for the student protests is very high in public opinion polls, there was a survey from February showing something like 80% of people surveyed supporting the demands made by the students in the protests. And when you say 80%, that's pretty close to everyone. But this expressed support is support in principle. It's support for the idea of an honest and accountable government. Once they have to put names on their list of candidates, then this ties them down. They're going to have to come up with a program. All of these things will narrow the base of support for the students and for the protesters. I mean, another thing we can say is that the regime is going to try to put off calling the elections as long as they can, hoping that time will work in their favor and that the unity of opinion supporting the protest movement will tend to deteriorate, will tend to fall apart. Another thing that we can say is that although we have not seen very much open violence yet, it is still unknown whether the process leading up to elections will be mostly nonviolent. But let's say that elections are called and that they are happened, and they come up with another similarly close result with the result of for the groups favoring the regime being inflated by the use of various techniques of manipulation and fraud. One thing that you can see is that the regime is already being prepared for its electoral support being brought down to a minority and close to a minority through the preventive construction of irredenta within the society. And this is the case with the phantom NGOs, monitoring movements, and other phantom NGO movements that they've formed. They've also done it with this phantom student movement, and this phantom student movement setting up a little camp, a permanent presence in land that they have occupied in a park across the street from the parliament. The second thing that I think you will see is that there is going to be a lot of effort on the part of people opposed to the regime not to repeat the mistake that they made when the precursor to this regime lost elections in 2000 and the opposition handed power over to a coalition led by the Democratic Party, which very, very quickly deteriorated in legitimacy, fundamentally did a bad job, lost the elections, so that it was difficult to see permanent results from the change of power in 2000. So this is an uncertain moment, and tensions are going to continue to be high for at least the next several months. Another thing, though, I think that we can say is that this moment is a key moment. Nobody really expected that the protest movement that began in November last year would be as large as it was, would gain as much popular support as it was, would be as powerful as it was, and would present such a challenge to the legitimacy of the regime. This is really their moment, and there are three things that can happen as a result of this massive growth of support. First of all, the movement for protest and opposition and for recreation of a democratic system could have a tremendous success. you could see the country turning toward a democratic and accountable order that it has not seen for several years. Similarly, you could also see a big failure. You still have in these local elections that were carried out yesterday, although it's uncertain, the regime claiming a victory. If they are able to make that claim and remain in power, then the period following the elections is probably going to see an increase in consolidation of power, consolidation of the informal networks that control power and access to social benefits, probably see an increase um, in repressive measures against people opposed to the regime. The most likely outcome, however, is that there will be something close to a balance of forces, one in which it will be difficult to say that the regime that is currently in power is entirely defeated. So the alternative to big success and big failure is big inertia, something similar to the period after 2003, when the elected Prime Minister Zoran Djindjic was assassinated, in which you see an attempt to balance out both the pro-democratic and the anti-democratic forces in the society, which means continued instability and continued lack of movement on the construction of forces that would help to consolidate a democratic order and an accountable public society. But one thing that is absolutely certain is that regardless of the type of change that we see after next year, there will be some type of change. This is a moment in which the regime has exposed its weakness. Things will continue in some way that is different from the way that they have been carried out until now. We'll have to see what way. This is a very interesting time to be following events and following the development of movements in the country. So that is this brief response to yesterday's local elections, and a brief prediction. Check back later and you will see whether the prediction was right or not. Thank you for your time and attention.